So you've probably heard the headlines. A social media ban, a government totally toppled, and a nation literally on fire. Back in September 2025, Nepal was just gripped by this crisis that seemed to come out of nowhere. But what really happened? Okay, let's get into it. We're going to break down exactly what these ZenG protests were all about and how they brought a country to its knees.
All right, so really wrap your head around this. You have to start with this number, over $3 billion. And let me be super clear here. That's not the total long-term cost. No. That's just the immediate economic damage from a few days of total chaos. I mean, that is an absolutely staggering figure for any country, but especially for Nepal.
So that leads us to the big question, right? The one we're really going to unpack here. How on earth did a government just deciding to ban 26 social media apps, how did that spiral and so quickly into a full-blown national crisis, one that cost billions and even brought down the prime minister? Well, the answer, it's a lot more complicated than you might think.
Okay, so let's start with the spark that lit the fuse. Because, all the headlines were talking about the social media ban. But honestly, that was just the tip of the iceberg. It was the trigger, for sure. But the real story is about what was simmering just below the surface for a very, very long time.
And just look at this timeline. It shows you how unbelievably explosive this whole thing was. September 4th, the government bans social media. Just 4 days later, on the 8th, the country is just rocked by violent protests. And then, the very next day, September 9th, the prime minister is out. He's forced to resign. I mean, think about that. That is an incredibly fast collapse of power.
But see, to really get why it collapsed so fast, you have to look past those headlines. The ban on stuff like Facebook and WhatsApp, that wasn't the real reason. It was just the catalyst. The real fuel for this fire? We're talking years of frustration. Frustration over massive government corruption, over nepotism, where it's all about who you know, and this crazy high youth unemployment rate, almost 21%. So for this young generation with basically no opportunities, social media wasn't just, for posting pictures. It was their voice. It was a lifeline. It was their window to the rest of the world. And when the government took that away, well, that was the final straw.
And the fallout from all this? Man, it was immediate. It was devastating. We're talking a full-on economic catastrophe for a nation that was already facing some serious challenges. So to get a sense of just how bad the economic hit was, you've got to understand this one key thing about Nepal's economy. Remittances. This is the money that Nepalese working abroad send back home to their families. And it makes up more than a quarter of the entire country's GDP. That's huge. We're talking $11 billion in 2024 alone. It is, without a doubt, the absolute financial lifeline for the entire nation. So think about this. When the government banned platforms like WhatsApp, they weren't just cutting off chats between friends. They were literally severing the main tool that over 2 million Nepali families use to coordinate and get that life-saving remittance money. This decision didn't just make people angry. It directly threatened their ability to put food on the table. It was personal.
And the physical damage was just everywhere. It was systemic. We saw symbols of the state, parliament, the Supreme Court, literally set on fire. Critical infrastructure, like the main international airport in Kathmandu, was completely shut down. Commerce just ground to a halt. You had banks being looted, and the key trade routes with India were totally paralyzed.
And these economic shockwaves, they didn't just stop at Nepal's border. The shutdown of those India-Nepal markets alone, get this, is estimated to have cost Indian companies $7 billion. It's just a really powerful reminder of how a crisis in one country can very quickly become a huge international problem. But look, as staggering as those financial numbers are, the true cost of this crisis, you just can't measure it in dollars and cents. The human toll was immense, and the social damage is something the country's going to be wrestling with for years, maybe even decades to come. I mean, in the middle of all that chaos, there were 13 separate prison breaks across the country. And the result? An estimated 15,000 criminals escaped and are now just out there. This isn't some temporary problem that's gonna go away. It is a massive, long-term security crisis that was born out of just a few days of unrest. And, of course, tragically, there was a very heavy cost in human lives. The reports show that somewhere between 19 and 27 civilians were killed, along with 3 police officers. Hundreds more people on both sides, protesters and police, were injured.
And behind every single one of those numbers is a family that was completely torn apart by the violence. So after all that, where does this leave Nepal today? Well, the country is staring down a deeply uncertain political future. You've got a government in shambles and an entire generation that's energized, angry, and demanding real fundamental change. And that brings us to where things stand right now. It's a standoff. Yeah, on the surface, you could say the protesters won, right? The prime minister's gone, the social media ban was lifted, but, and this is a huge but, the army is still on the streets enforcing a curfew. And the protesters' core demands, the big ones, like dissolving parliament and holding new elections to actually root out the corruption, those have been completely ignored. So no, this crisis is far, far from over. And that really leaves us with this final big question. You can rebuild a parliament building, right? You can reopen an airport. But how do you rebuild the trust that has been shattered between an entire generation and its government? The true price of this crisis, it might not be the billions of dollars lost. It's the monumental challenge of restoring faith in a system that so many young people feel has completely and utterly failed them. Because, as Nepal is finding out the hard way, that's a price you just can't put a number on.
Welcome to The Explainer. So, after weeks of widespread protests brought Nepal to a complete standstill, the country now faces a massive, multi-billion-dollar question. How do you even begin to rebuild a nation? $3 billion. That's the estimated financial cost of the protests that recently rocked the nation. And it's a staggering figure, right? It represents widespread property damage, devastating business disruptions, and a near total halt to the national economy. I mean, for a while there, the country's economic pulse had nearly stopped. You had army curfews in place, the main airport in Kathmandu was temporarily shut down, and this deep political uncertainty was just looming over everything. Daily commerce, the flow of money, it all just ground to a halt.
Okay, so let's dive into this. To really understand the road ahead, we first need to get our heads around the full scale of the crisis that Nepal is facing.
You know, the damage went so far beyond just the financial cost. This was a deep shock to the country's core infrastructure and its civil order. The parliament and Supreme Court were damaged, sure, but what's really crazy is that 15,000 inmates escaped from prisons. That alone created a massive, immediate security challenge.
So when you're faced with that level of chaos, the first priority for any nation is stabilization. So let's take a look at the first critical phase of Nepal's recovery effort. And the approach is pretty clear and focused. The government, along with civilian groups, is tackling a three-pronged strategy to get the country back on its feet. First, restore security, then begin repairing property, and finally, provide compensation to the victims.
And this highlights a really immediate grassroots effort. While the army was moving to increase patrols, you had citizens themselves out there clearing debris just so they could reopen local markets. That's the first essential step toward getting daily economic life back to normal. Now get this, $1 to $2 billion. That's the estimated price tag just for repairing the major government buildings that were damaged. It's a massive undertaking that could take anywhere from 6 to 12 months to complete, and it really highlights the long road of reconstruction that lies ahead.
Having a plan is one thing, but paying for it? That's another story. So when you're faced with a multi-billion-dollar recovery bill, where does a nation like Nepal find the resources for such a massive rebuild?
Well, the answer isn't simple. It's going to come from a combination of domestic resilience, leveraging the country's unique economic structure, and of course, turning to that global lifeline of international support. A huge piece of this puzzle is remittances. That's the money sent home by Nepalese working abroad. As you can see from this chart, they make up nearly a third of the entire GDP. That flow of cash is more vital to the economy than almost any other single sector.
So that means getting that financial lifeline back online is priority number one. After a disruptive social media ban was lifted, reestablishing contact with those 2 million workers abroad is absolutely vital to normalizing that annual flow of over $11 billion.
Beyond remittances, Nepal is going to look to its international partners like the World Bank and neighbors like India and China for aid. But it's also going to look inward, maybe by issuing bonds and, importantly, finding savings by tackling corruption, which, you'll remember, was a key demand of the protesters in the first place. But you know, this isn't just about rebuilding what was lost. The recovery plan also has to address the root causes that led to the protests in the first place. And the long-term strategy seems to directly respond to the grievances that drove people into the streets.
High youth unemployment is being met with skilled training, corruption with a stronger anti-corruption body, and political instability with calls for new elections and reform.
The goal isn't just to repair the damage, it's about building a more resilient and diverse economy. This includes things like launching a Safe Nepal campaign to bring back tourists, reopening that vital $7 billion trade route with India, and attracting new foreign investment into key growth sectors.
This timeline gives us a pretty good idea of the journey ahead, and recovery won't happen overnight. It's expected to happen in phases, starting with local businesses reopening, followed by major reconstruction, with a full economic recovery potentially taking 1 to 2 years. The plan is ambitious, and the path is laid out, but success is far from guaranteed. It all really hinges on a very delicate and precarious balance of factors.
And ultimately, Nepal's recovery rests on this knife's edge. Success depends on achieving political stability, securing swift international aid, and keeping those remittances flowing. But the risks are always there. The possibility of renewed protests or delays in forming a new government could send everything sliding backward. And this projection from the World Bank shows exactly what's at stake. One path leads to nearly 5% GDP growth and a strong recovery. The other path, the one marked by continued unrest, could lead to economic contraction. The choice made in the coming weeks and months will determine which future becomes a reality.
And so this remains the central, unanswered question. The world is watching to see whether this profound moment of crisis for Nepal can be transformed into a catalyst for lasting reform and genuine progress.
After being rocked by massive protests, Nepal is now standing at a major crossroads. The streets might be quiet for now, but that silence is filled with a huge question about what comes next. And that question, well, it all starts with a number. A really, really big one. Yup, that's the bill for all the recent unrest. We're talking $1 to $2 billion. That's the estimated price tag to fix crucial public infrastructure, everything from the parliament building to the courts. It's a giant hole blown into the national budget, and it leads to a very obvious and very painful question. So who is going to pay for all this? That's the question on everyone's mind, from top government officials all the way down to the citizens on the street. You see, the protests didn't just break windows and damage buildings. They've sparked a full-blown financial crisis. This is way bigger than just a construction bill. This is about trying to stabilize an entire economy that's been pushed right to the edge. Okay, so when a government needs money, and needs it fast, what's usually the first lever they pull? Taxes. It's often the most direct route. So let's dig into the case for raising taxes, and why some people think it's basically the only choice they have. It's really a domino effect when you think about it. First, you've got the physical damage, and you need a ton of cash to rebuild. At the same time, all the unrest has scared off tourists and messed up trade, so government revenue is shrinking. And all of this is hitting an economy that was already pretty shaky. Now, GDP growth is expected to fall by 1 or 2%. The government is really facing a perfect storm. To really get why this is such a big deal, you have to look at how Nepal's economy is put together. Tax revenue alone makes up nearly a quarter of the entire GDP. When your main source of funding is that big, any kind of disruption creates an immediate crisis. And in the broader economy, money sent home from Nepalis working abroad is an even bigger piece of the pie, which just shows you how fragile the whole situation can be. You know, this idea of raising taxes during a crisis, it's not exactly new in the region. After its massive 2015 earthquake, Nepal itself talked about hiking its value-added tax, or VAT. And more recently, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh have both looked at tax changes after their own major protests. It's a pretty standard page in the economic crisis playbook. But just because it's in the playbook doesn't mean it's the right move, not by a long shot. In fact, there's a really powerful argument that raising taxes could be the absolute worst thing for Nepal to do right now. And history shows us there's a pretty powerful alternative. After the 2015 earthquake, Nepal secured $4 billion in international aid. That's double the highest estimate for the current damages. That precedent alone shows that turning to the global community instead of its own citizens is a very, very viable path. And this brings us to the political reality of the situation. I mean, think about it. The protests were never about economics in the first place. The main demand was for less corruption. So to ask those same citizens to pay more now, that could be seen as a huge betrayal, one that risks sending them right back into the streets.
And it's not like there aren't other options. There are other financial tools out there. The government could issue bonds, borrowing money from investors, or they could use what are called public-private partnerships to get companies to help fund the rebuilding. Each of these paths avoids putting the financial burden directly on people who are already at their breaking point.
Okay, so we've got two completely different arguments clashing here. So what's actually going to happen? Let's get practical and look at the timeline for how and when this decision is likely to be made.
This isn't something that's going to get sorted out overnight. Right now, the focus is just on figuring out how bad the damage is and putting out those first calls for international help. Over the next 3 to 6 months, we'll probably see a temporary government form, and that's when the real policy debates will start. Any actual tax changes likely wouldn't be introduced for another 6 to 12 months, probably as part of the annual budget.
So this is the fundamental choice, really. Path A is the direct route. Raise the VAT from 13% to 15%. Maybe add some extra taxes on fuel and imports. It gets the money quickly, but you risk an enormous public backlash. Path B is the more diplomatic route. Use international aid and loans to prioritize political stability, but that makes Nepal a lot more reliant on outside help.
And let's be crystal clear about who pays the price in Path A. Any new taxes on consumption or income would disproportionately hit the youth and the middle class, the very same groups who were leading the recent protests. This brings us right to the heart of the dilemma facing Nepal's leaders. It's a classic high-stakes balancing act between two absolutely critical priorities.
You can think of it as an economic tightrope. On one side, there's the urgent need for fiscal recovery. On the other, the very real risk that whatever solution you pick just ignites more political unrest. It's an incredibly delicate balance, where one wrong step could be disastrous. And that leaves us with the ultimate question. The challenge here isn't just about finding the money. It's about whether it's even possible for Nepal's leadership to navigate this crisis in a way that rebuilds both the nation's economy and the public's trust. The path they choose will define Nepal for years to come.